So now you're here again, knocking at my door. A little too late for, I'm sorry for. The lights went out cause you kept cutting the cord, and I started to fade.
E21, E30, E36, E46, E90, F30, and now G20. These are the model codes for the BMW 3 Series. The epitome of a sports sedan. This car is not only important for BMW, they say this is their heartbeat, but it's also important for the entire world of sedans in a world that is now obsessed with SUVs. After all, over the course of 40 years, they have sold 15 million of these. In the past, I've had the pleasure of owning an E30, an E36, and this is my current daily driver, the F30, the outgoing generation of the 3 Series. This one is the brand new 7th generation.
I waited for you in the passenger seat.
And if I'm honest, the outgoing generation became a little bit too soft for my liking. It's certainly not as driver focused as the E30 or the E36 was, and certainly not as driver focused as the E90, which was the first generation 3 Series that we got in India. So with the latest generation, BMW has a challenge on their hands. Not only do they have to make it absolutely tech-laden and cutting edge, they also have to ensure that it goes back to its roots of being an absolute genuine sports sedan. That's why we brought the two of them together. We've come to see if BMW has moved the game on, both in terms of tech, luxury, but also in terms of the driving experience. The first thing that strikes you when you put these two together is the fact that BMW has ensured that the 3 Series now stands out far more than before. Gone is the sleek, slender front end, and in are these big, massive kidney grills. The kidney grills are not only bigger and more brash, but they're also smarter as well. These are active kidney grills that open and close depending on the temperature, and they do that because it's more aerodynamically efficient for them to operate when they're closed rather than when they're wide open. You've also got headlights that have sharper creases that make their presence felt. On the whole, the new 3 looks far more imposing than the outgoing model. It's still related, however, but it definitely makes its presence felt. The grille isn't quite as big and imposing and brash as the facelifted 7 Series or the X7, but it's certainly a lot more in your face. In profile, the G20 is unmistakably a 3 Series. But when you put the two together, what strikes you immediately is just how much bigger the new 3 has become. Yes, it's 55 kilos lighter, but it's also bigger. It's 16 mm wider and it's 76 mm longer. And the reason for that is to open up space inside the cabin and to make it more spacious and luxurious than before. But if you look at it in profile, it has all the lines that you would expect in a 3 Series, including the famous BMW Hofmeister kink. And I really like how they've integrated it into the profile of this car, because you open it and it's got a really sleek, slender rear door. I happen to think that the rear is the best angle of the new 3 Series. I think it looks absolutely fantastic. When you put these two together, that's when the old one really starts to look dated, because this looks really sleek and slender and modern. And for the first time, the new 3 Series, even in 320 guise, has twin tailpipes at the back, which makes it look really sporty. As for those twin tailpipes, that's an aftermarket addition to quench my boy racer thirst. For obvious reasons, I feel like I've come home when I'm sitting in the driver's seat of this car. And the 3 Series, right from the first generation, the E21, ensured that the cockpit was really driver focused. The central tunnel was always angled towards the driver, and it was exaggerated in the E36. And everything just falls perfectly to hand. This is a sport variant of the 328i, so it's an all black interior with these red accents, and it feels really, really driver focused, and everything falls perfectly to hand. I'm sitting facing two beautiful, simple gauges for the tach and the speedometer, and it's very much in keeping with the 3 Series tradition. The only issue with this cabin is that it is a little bit tight. Especially if you're sitting in the back, it can feel a little bit cramped and you do feel a little hemmed in. And that's where the new 3 Series comes in, because you really feel like you moved up a class when you get into the cabin of the new 3. In fact, it feels like you moved up a segment. Not only does it have a real sense of space, the 41mm increase in wheelbase really gives you a feeling of being able to spread out versus the older car, which felt a little bit cramped. And not that the quality levels in the older car were bad, but you really do feel like they've taken a step up. Our test car has this beautiful chocolate brown coffee interior. It's got dark wood trim, it's got silver accents, and it feels really, really well put together. On the tech front, it's really taken a step up as well. You've got BMW's brand new iDrive system, and it's got a new touchscreen in the center console, which has a curved glass, which BMW says is the only curved glass in the automotive world. And it blends into the brand new instrument cluster, the new digital instrument cluster, which I happen to think works really, really well. So I'm a traditionalist and I love the old analog gauges because they're really intuitive, very easy to use, and they hark back to BMW's heritage. But the new instrument cluster, which has the gauges at the two ends, frees up space in the middle for a bunch of information, and it works really, really well. The only thing is that BMW is missing a little bit of a trick, because when you've got cars like the Hyundai Venue, the MG Hector and the Kia Seltos, which come with built-in connectivity features, and you get into ostensibly a luxury car like this, or even all the way up to a 7 Series which costs $1.5 crore, and you don't find the same level of connectivity, then you have to ask yourself whether or not they're missing a trick somewhere. And this is where you see the benefit of that increased space, because you no longer feel punished when you're sitting in the back of a 3 Series. It's still unmistakably a driver's car. It's not a luxury sedan, but if you do happen to find yourself in the rear seat, it's actually pretty comfortable and quite spacious as well. And what I really like about the cabin, even from the driver's seat, is that they've been able to blend the digital and the analog almost perfectly, because you get an actual volume control knob, which you don't find in a lot of new cars, especially ones that have touchscreens. And you also get buttons for the AC controls. So you don't have to go into a menu to try and adjust the temperature or the volume for the audio. So the first thing is that these two cars aren't directly comparable on the road. This is a 328i with a turbo petrol engine and 240 horsepower. That is a 320d with a 2-liter turbo diesel engine that produces 188 horsepower and 400 Nm of torque. What they do have in common, or what they should have in common, is the inherent goodness of a BMW chassis. They both have 50-50 weight distribution, and they both have just brilliant chassis. And that is why I love this car so much. It has just got the truest handling in the world. You can, being rear-wheel drive, you can use the rear end to just rotate around corners if you're feeling a little bit adventurous, and that's why I love this machine. The other thing that the two of them have in common is an 8-speed ZF gearbox and these paddles behind the steering wheel, all of which makes this a really involving driving experience. The trouble with this generation, the F30, is that BMW, in an effort to make it comfortable, more luxurious and more usable, and less focused towards the driver perhaps, made the suspension a little bit too soft, at least for my liking, as a result of which, when you're at high speed and the road surface isn't perfect, the car tends to wallow just that little bit. It tends to feel a little bit floaty, and it doesn't give you a sense that this car was engineered, at least in this suspension setup, for either the Nürburgring or the Autobahn in Germany. The other thing that's in line with BMW's philosophy is that this is a brilliant driving position. I can set the seat really low down. I've got these big bolsters on the side which hold me perfectly in place, and the cockpit is cocooned around me, and it's the perfect driving position with which to focus on the act of driving. So immediately when you get into the driving seat of the new 3 Series, it feels like you've moved into a more luxurious machine. Just from when you put your hands on the steering wheel itself, because the steering wheel the leather is more padded and it's softer, and it just gives you a totally different feel. Yes, the cabin is very familiar, the switchgear is very familiar, but it certainly feels much more like a luxury car in here than in the previous generation 3. We've also got an acoustic glass windshield in this generation of 3 Series, so the insulation is far better. There's hardly any wind noise, there's hardly any road noise. It's really a much more serene experience. The car that we're driving is the 320D, so it's got the diesel engine under the bonnet, but I challenge anyone from the driver's seat to tell that there's a diesel under the hood, because it is extremely refined and it is extremely quiet. The main difference in the powertrain between this and the previous generation 320D is that this has 2 turbos, one low pressure turbo and one high pressure turbo. So it kicks in very gently and it doesn't have that turbo lag and then the shove in the back when the power kicks in. It's very linear in its power delivery and it feels far more refined than before. But that's not to say that it isn't fast, because watch this. Hey BMW, I'm bored.
I can't imagine that you're bored. Maybe you haven't yet had the chance to try sport mode.
Sport mode. Let's drop a few gears, put your foot down, and the car accelerates seamlessly. The only annoying thing is in all new cars now is you've got a chime at 80 kilometers an hour. In this car you've got a chime at 100 and you've got a constant beep that stays with you above 120 kilometers an hour, and that can be really annoying. But the key with this car to get rid of that wallowy effect is that BMW has made this chassis far stiffer than before. The mounting points of the front suspension, the wishbones and the strut mounts are 50% stiffer than the previous generation 3 Series. And I can attest to the fact that that car isn't made of jelly. So this one feels really solid. The advantage of having a stiffer chassis setup is not only that the car is far more dynamic and the handling is much better, but the manufacturer can also tone down the suspension setting and still retain that sense of the car being hunkered down. So it's comfortable and it handles better both at the same time. This particular car is running on a set of 17-inch wheels versus the 328 in sport trim, which is on 18s. Run flat tire technology also has moved up from what it used to be in the past, so it's far more comfortable than before. The only disadvantage with this machine is that it has run flats, but it also has a spare tire in the back, which means that boot space is very limited. But the benefit, of course, of this chassis stiffness and the overall stiffness in the structure of this car is that it feels really good when you're going down the road. The steering might be light when you're at low speeds, but it weighs up nicely and it feels really direct when you pick up speed. And it really gives you a sense of being one with this machine. The grip levels are phenomenal, and at least on the 320D it's really difficult to get this car to slide because it has so much grip that it just won't let you do anything untoward. So all said and done, Darwin would be pleased, because the theory of evolution applies in the automotive world when you take the new 3 Series into account. It is in every way, from an objective standpoint, better than the previous generation car. It's more spacious, it's better built, it's more luxurious, it drives better. The only trouble is, for me, I would say that as good as the 320D is, this chassis just outclasses the 188 horsepower that this engine produces. So maybe the 330i would be the way to go. 18-inch rims at least at a minimum, because this car is bigger and the 17s just look puny on this 320D. So is it the ultimate sports sedan? Well, it's far more comfortable and far more luxurious than ever before. In 320D trim, it feels more like slightly scaled down 5 Series. It feels like a luxury car that drives really well when you push it. So maybe for that sports sedan experience, you need a 330i with M Sport trim, or even better, perhaps an all-wheel drive 340i with a 3-litre inline-6 turbo petrol engine if BMW decides to bring that into India. But for the moment, if you're looking for a step up from the previous generation 3 Series and a car that drives really well and that is incredibly refined, then the 320D is your pick. If you want a car that gives you a little bit of a fizz, then you need a 330i at the very least.
So now you're here again, knocking at my door. A little too late for, I'm sorry for. The lights went out cause you kept cutting the cord, and I started to fade into